Welcome to Unlocking Potential, a Red Door Pediatric Therapy podcast. We're your hosts, Heather and Kelli.
With master's degrees in speech-language pathology and decades of pediatric experience, we've been the co-owners of Red Door Pediatric Therapy since 2006.
On this podcast, we share stories and strategies that can unlock the potential of functional, behavioral, emotional, and social development in children today.
Today's guest is Mandy Griffin, speech-language pathologist at Red Door Pediatric Therapy. Welcome back, Mandy, to the podcast. We are talking about orofacial myofunctional disorders today. I'd like you to first start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Mandy Griffin. I'm a speech-language pathologist, and I've been with Red Door for 6 years. I'm a certified orofacial myologist as of 2020, and continue my learning journey. It's just so much to know.
So orofacial myofunctional disorders is a big, huge, mumbly word. What does that mean? We call it OMD, but what do those words mean?
Right. So OMD is basically when we have atypical patterns in regard to swallowing, talking, and even breathing based on how we use our muscles and how our structure can kind of impact some of those patterns, or like even ongoing oral habits like thumb sucking or ongoing pacifier use that can just kind of impact how we use our muscles and therefore how we swallow and breathe and talk down the road.
How does OMD affect kids?
So it can affect kids in a lot of different ways, but most often at Red Door, we see kids that come in with speech sound differences. So for example, like the S that comes out a little bit too far forward, like a lisp like this. Mm-hmm. We also see kids that come in having a hard time tolerating different types of food. They might really enjoy chicken nuggets and hot dogs, but won't touch vegetables or fruits. And we also see kids that come in who really just have a hard time kicking the habit of like a thumb sucking pattern or pacifier use. So those would be the three biggest ones that we treat for.
What tells you that it's OMD and not just kind of a typical speech or sound disorder?
Mm-hmm. Sometimes we get kids coming in for an evaluation and we think, oh, it's just a typical speech sound disorder. But when they come and sit in my chair, I can tell right away if it's more than that. Usually the first thing I notice is that they're breathing with their mouth open. Mm-hmm. You see kind of this low tone body. We see that jaw kind of hanging low and that tongue sticking out a little bit. That's the first red flag that I notice. Next thing is once they start talking, I hear their speech. And then after a while in the evaluation, we'll take a closer look at their structure. So what their mouth looks like, how they're using their muscles, and then we'll have a little snack just so I can see how they're using their muscles when they're swallowing. And usually pretty quickly we can decide that it's really OMD and not just a speech sound difference.
Sure. So how then, if left untreated, how does that present itself when you have kids that are older, or dare I even say adults who have carried this OMD unknowingly into their adulthood?
Yes. I think most people actually have some sort of OMD. So we all kind of live through this life and we just kind of think that that's normal. As we get to an adult, let's say we do have an underlying OMD, but we don't have atypical speech, or we don't have problems when we're young with foods and things like that. When we grow up, all of a sudden it might be that you've had braces and now your teeth are shifting again and you need braces again. Mm-hmm. Or you might see you're having headaches more often every day when you wake up. You might feel that jaw really hurting during the day. You might have your dentist say, you really clench your teeth at night, and end up with a splint. So there's lots of things as we get older that we can kind of see that OMD shining through.
Is sleep apnea one of those things that sometimes clues people in?
So I haven't talked a lot about sleep quite yet, but sleep is a big part of OMDs. And that's one of the questions we ask when you first come in is, how do you sleep, or how does your child sleep at night? If we see them waking up a lot, any snoring or periods of like apnea where they stop breathing for a minute, that's all concerning. And we usually will refer out after that to like an ENT or an airway-centric dentist to see if we can get you breathing better. Because if you're not breathing well, you're not sleeping well, and it's hard to attend, and it's hard to just do life when you're tired.
Learning
Too.
Absolutely. What age do you kind of differentiate if it's OMD? I mean, is it for really little kids, or is there kind of a line in the sand age-wise?
Yeah, there's definitely a line in the sand, and it's age 4.
Okay.
But we also see the writing on the wall. Even when we get these babies coming in for infant feeding, we can kind of tell if they're heading down that direction. So while treatment looks different after age 4, we can try to guide those structures and guide that function to where we want it to be to lessen the effect or eliminate it altogether. So
interesting. Is this kind of a new thing? I mean, not new as in its existence, but new as something that is being treated?
Well, OMD has been around forever. In early 1900s, like 1907, I think, to be exact, there was an orthodontist, Edward Engel, who started talking about how we breathe and how our mouth rests and how our tongue can impact how our teeth grow in and how our dentition can form. So it's really not new. The term myofunctional therapy has been around for a while too, 1917, 1918, somewhere in there.
Wow.
So it's been around for a while, but it's really starting to catch on because the more you know, the more you can't really deny that this is a thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it is kind of a fine line between dentists and orthodontists, and how a speech-language pathologist comes in terms of the overall treatment. How do you collaborate or correlate with those professionals?
Mm-hmm. We correlate all the time. Collaborate all the time, I should say. So usually when they'll come in for an eval or an initial assessment, we'll talk about, who their dentist is, who's their orthodontist, have they been in, depending on their age, have they been in for a consult for ortho? And if we see any structural needs, we would refer them out to either one, or sometimes I'll say, I'm questioning this. Like an example would be if I have a kiddo that comes in with a really narrow palate. So the roof of the mouth is very arched and narrow. Mom tells me the kiddo is having a hard time sleeping, swallowing's hard, talking's hard. Then I might ask either the orthodontist or an airway-centric dentist based on their age to take another look just to see if there's something we can do for that palate. Because when you think about what's right behind your palate, it's your airway. So if you have this really small, narrow mouth, you have a really small, narrow airway too. And when you try to get good breaths through your nose, it's really hard. So we work really closely with them just to make sure structurally we're heading in a good direction.
Mm-hmm. This is a lot of information, and it's super interesting. I think from a parent perspective, how would you know to seek services? How would you be like, you know what? I think I'm going to call Red Door about this. How would you know?
I would say if you're watching this and you look over at your kiddo and they're breathing like this.
With an open mouth.
Step 1. Yeah. It's like when we look at treating OMDs, it's a pyramid. Step 1 is breathing. They have to be able to breathe comfortably through their nose. I would also say listen to their speech. If they're forward, not necessarily just with their S's and Z's, but like T's and D's. If everything is kind of poking out of the mouth and you see their tongue a lot, that could be OMD or it could be speech. Either way, we can help you.
Yep.
And then the other thing I would look for would be watching them eat. A lot of times when we have an OMD per se, it's really noisy eating, smacking. We see that tongue a lot. When we're swallowing to go to take a drink, you might see the tongue peeking through the lips. But any of those 3 would be a reason to call, or poor sleep. That's a big one.
Well, how does swallowing integrate into all of these things that you do with OMD and speech?
Mm-hmm. So when we look at speech treatment just by itself without OMD involved, sometimes we get a good placement. Let's say for S, we get it behind the teeth and we practice and we practice and we practice and we practice and it goes really well. But then as soon as we stop therapy, it comes out again. So when we look at OMD and how to incorporate the swallow and the breathing into speech, it just makes sense. So when we start from square one, we work on getting the tongue back when we're breathing, and we work on getting the tongue back when we're making a food ball as we're chewing, and we keep the tongue back when we're swallowing, which only helps us learn to keep it back for speech. So if we can go to step 1 and start fixing all those little pieces, all of a sudden, sometimes we don't even need speech therapy at the end because we've fixed everything that's caused everything else to be forward.
That's a great point, because I think a question we get asked a lot in all forms of the services we provide is, how long is this going to take? And so I think you've driven home a great point that actually the goal is to make very steady progress on sound production. And if we're not making very steady progress, then there might be another reason or something a little more going on, with the idea that then if it ends up being OMD, we're still there to make steady progress so that you're not at Red Door for terribly long time. And so how long, best case scenario, this is the worst and best question, does it take?
It depends. With OMD, home programming is huge because we're asking you to change swallowing, which you do all day long, and breathing, which you do all day long. So it depends on the kiddo, it depends on the parents, and it depends on their relationship and how well they can work on what we're talking about in our 30 minutes outside of therapy. So we talk a lot about working in the car when we're driving from A to B, because we know it's hard to find 15 minutes to sit down and do speech at the end of the day.
Yep.
So we work on incorporating it into just songs when we're at home, or where's your tongue? How's your tongue resting right now? Just simple little cues like that, in addition to a few little exercises, can go a long way. I've seen some families who are very structured and get their work done at home, get through the OMD part in 6 months or less. And then we'll kind of clean up any speech errors after that if they're residual.
Sure. Mandy, Kelli and I also went to school for speech pathology, and we didn't learn anything about OMD along the way. So how does that work with regard to your knowledge base and your certification and finding a professional that provides these services?
I didn't learn about this in college either. So as I knew more and more and learned more and more, I knew it's a ball of wax. So I went to a course in 2019. It's a 3-day course, just learning more about all of this. Then after that, I decided to pursue a certification where I went through a very lengthy written exam. Then after I passed my written exam, I had to do an on-site visit. So another certified orofacial myologist watched me work that day and decided that I was able to become certified. So not every speech therapist has this knowledge. And a lot of times in the schools, they can't really treat for OMD. So it's really a specialized part of being a speech language pathologist.
Absolutely. It kind of goes along with the trend that we've talked about in other episodes, where we find a need in the community and we do our best to meet it. And so this really falls in line with that kind of overall mentality, I guess.
Yes. And it's hard when parents come in sometimes, because they come in looking for a speech sound eval and they want to make these L's and these R's better. But then we say, hold on, we're going to work on breathing first, and then we're going to work on swallowing. So sometimes it's hard to get that buy-in, but we've really seen great results and fast results when we start from square one. Then we can see the rest of those speech sounds hopefully fall into place.
You have to go back to the origin of the problem and progress from that starting point. That makes sense.
Absolutely. What types of impacts have you seen with OMD therapy?
We see great lifestyle changes. First of all, being able to breathe better makes you feel better. We see kids eating better foods. We see them sounding better and more understandable, and it's really cool. One of my favorites is when I get a kiddo coming in with a long oral habit, so thumb sucking. You can basically see their mouth shaping around this little thumb. So once we work on our habit elimination program, get the thumb out of the mouth, get them breathing and eating differently, then we can physically see their little face change, and those teeth will kind of go back to where they're supposed to be in a matter of a few weeks and months. Sometimes they need a little bit of help down the road with orthodontics, but it's really cool to be able to change that structure for the better just with simple changes in behavior.
Oh, that is fascinating. Mm-hmm. Mandy, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing this information.
Absolutely. This is impactful for kids and families, and as always, we appreciate all that you do.
Thank you for having me. It was great to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Unlocking Potential, a Red Door Pediatric Therapy podcast.
Please like and subscribe for more interviews and content, or connect with us online at reddoorpediatric.com.
Thanks for joining us, and remember, communication is key to unlocking your potential.